All right, so this is a lecture on embryonic development, which is part of chapter 22 in your textbook. We are not going to be covering all of chapter 22, so I know 22 kind of starts out with talking about the different organ systems that are present within the human body, and you do not need to remember all those organ systems or the feedback loops and things like that. And we're also not going to be discussing all the anatomical differences between males and females. We're just going to focus mainly on the process of fertilization and how organisms go through different developmental stages. Okay, so to start off with, all right, if we're talking about embryonic development, we need to start with the gametes. So all along we've talked about gametes and mentioned that they are the egg cells and the sperm cells, and that the process of meiosis is responsible for producing these gametes. So we're going to use the term oogenesis and spermatogenesis to refer to the production of an egg cell or a sperm cell. So obviously spermatogenesis refers to creation of the sperm cell. So genesis is a suffix that refers to the creation or the beginning. So kind of creating the sperm, and the oogenesis refers to the creation of eggs. So oo, it's either Latin or Greek, is for eggs. So I know it sounds kind of funny, but that's kind of the way it is. So we mentioned that these gametes are produced by the process of meiosis. So in the figure on the right, you can see oogenesis to the left of spermatogenesis, which is on the right in the purple. And they both start out with precursor cells. These are diploid cells, right? So if you remember, meiosis starts out with diploid cells and produces haploid gametes by the end. So the precursor cell is basically like a stem cell that is present within the ovaries or within the testes. And this cell will go through mitosis. Okay, so not meiosis yet, but mitosis to produce additional cells, which become what we call the primary oocyte or the primary spermatocyte, referring to the primary sperm cell or the primary egg cell. It is these cells that will then undergo meiosis. So you see within males, meiosis kind of looks pretty similar to what we've talked about in the past, where we go through meiosis 1 and produce 2 haploid daughter cells where homologous chromosomes are separated. We go through meiosis 2, and now we have 4 daughter cells that are all haploid. So spermatogenesis is pretty much meiosis straightforward. And as we mentioned, this is occurring in the testes of the males. And this typically starts around puberty, and millions of sperm are produced each day by a male. So the sperm kind of lives out its life and it dies and it's replaced by new sperm all the time. Now, oogenesis is a little bit different. Here we see during meiosis 1, we have 2 daughter cells that are produced. One definitely looks different than the other one. So one's bigger and the other one's smaller. The smaller one is what we call a polar body. And this is not viable. It's not a viable cell, really. So what happens is cytokinesis does not evenly divide the cell into 2 daughter cells. So one of them becomes bigger and gets most of the cytoplasm, and the other one, the other cell, is really just a means to get rid of the other homologous chromosomes. So then we follow this secondary oocyte, and it goes through meiosis 2 to produce 2 more daughter cells, and the same thing happens. We have uneven cytokinesis, and we make a second polar body. So really, in females, through the process of meiosis, only one egg cell is being produced. So another important thing to note in females is that they are born with all the eggs that they will ever have during their lifetime. So this process of producing eggs actually starts before they are born. So it starts while they're developing in the mother's womb. And then it resumes during puberty, right? During the monthly cycle, an egg is released. So at that point, it kind of picks up meiosis again to produce the egg cell, and then it actually finishes things off once it's fertilized. So it's kind of a much more prolonged process of meiosis in females. Um, but females, like we said, are born with millions of egg cells, the beginnings of egg cells, and then over the course of their lifetime, no new eggs are produced, and the eggs actually are reduced over time, right? So females actually lose a lot more eggs, and they're losing an egg every month as well, or an egg is being produced every month, or released, I should say. An egg is released during ovulation every month from the ovaries. Okay. So the process of fertilization refers to when the egg is fertilized by the sperm cell. So when the egg and the sperm cell meet up and produce a zygote. So we just went through the process of making our haploid gametes, and when those two combine together to produce a zygote, we're back up to our diploid number again. So the sperm, all right, for fertilization to occur, the sperm has to be introduced into the female's reproductive system. So it's introduced into the vagina, and the sperm swim up the vagina and through an opening in the uterus that is called the cervix. So the cervix is the lower end of the uterus, and they swim up through the cervix and up the uterus and all the way into the fallopian tubes, which are these tubes on either side of this kind of triangular uterus. Now, in females, the ovaries are located at the end of the fallopian tubes. They're actually not directly connected to them. They're not part of the fallopian tubes. They have these finger-like projections that kind of help to sweep any egg cells that are released from the ovaries into the fallopian tubes. So the egg cell is released into the tube, and the sperm cell is coming up the tube, and it fertilizes the egg cell within the fallopian tubes. So this is where fertilization happens, is within that tube. Once the egg has been fertilized, then it travels back down. It hasn't gone down the tube yet, but it travels down the tube and will implant within the lining of the uterus. So this is where the zygote will continue its development and go through mitotic cell divisions, is within the uterus. So development happens in the uterus, but fertilization happens within the fallopian tube. Now, what can happen is if that fertilized egg cell doesn't travel down the fallopian tube and kind of hangs out in there and continues to go through mitosis and divide and try to develop further, it will create what's called an ectopic pregnancy, where the continued cell divisions and the continued development into an embryo becomes a problem, because this area is so small it cannot support a growing baby as a uterus could. So because of that, it's not going to result in a viable pregnancy, and it can be very dangerous to the mother as well. So once we have a fertilized egg or a zygote, the zygote then goes through mitotic cell divisions. And so this is what we call cleavage. So cleavage refers to cytokinesis that happens in animal cells. So we have our zygote here, our single cell, and it's going to go through more cleavage, more cell divisions to further divide up the zygote. So we have an 8-cell stage where we have 4 cells on top, 4 cells on the bottom, and then it continues to go through even more cell divisions. So notice the cells are pretty big originally in this 8-cell stage, and then they're getting smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller because they're just dividing up. It's not the whole zygote is not getting any bigger in size at this point in time. It's just going through mitotic divisions. And pretty soon it forms a ball of cells that we call a blastula. So the blastula is hollow on the inside, and it's just all these cells on the outside. The blastula then goes through this process of gastrulation. So gastrulation is where the cells start to differentiate, they start to take on a certain role, and they rearrange themselves. So the cells actually rearrange to produce the different germ tissue layers. So the cells are going to divide slowly, they're going to differentiate, and they're going to reorganize, and there's some increase in size that happens later on as well. So what we're going to see with this reorganization is the development of tissue layers. And these early embryonic tissue layers are called germ tissue layers because they give rise to the different organ systems. So we have the ectoderm, which is on the outside or the outer layer of cells. And this ectoderm actually pushes inward, as you see here, to kind of form that little invagination. And that then becomes the endoderm. Endo referring to inside, ecto referring to outside. So the ectoderm is outside, endoderm is inside. And then it's not really showing, but there is mesoderm that is between your ectoderm and your endoderm. So that kind of darker blue layer that they're calling the blastocell. There's some cells down at the bottom that will start dividing and may line, especially in some animals, this area here to form a mesoderm. So listed by each of these germ tissue layers, you can see that there are different organ systems that originate from each of these three different germ tissue layers. So the nervous system comes from the ectoderm. Your skin comes from ectoderm, which makes sense because your skin's on the outside, but also the lining of the mouth and the rectum. So this kind of invagination here can form either your mouth or the rectum area, like the opening to the outside of a body. The mesoderm is muscles, right? So the mesoderm develops into muscle, your skeletal system, circulatory system, and reproductive systems. And then the endoderm develops into the lining of your digestive system, so it completes your digestive system and your respiratory systems. So in addition to forming these different germ tissue layers, it also helps to establish kind of a body plan. So during gastrulation, it starts to form kind of an anterior and posterior, or kind of head region and a tail region, and a dorsal and a ventral surface, kind of a back side and a belly side. So it kind of gets its left and its right axis. So it kind of gets this body oriented so that the tissues can start developing within the correct areas of the body.